I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector Podcast, and we are on location at the Minds and Money Conference in Miami, Florida. And I have our youngest contributor. We've added somebody else since, so we can't call him the rookie anymore. But Ted J Butler has joined me from his new domain in Colombia. Welcome to Miami, Ted.
Thanks for having me, Mike, as always. It's nice to be recognized for my youth and optimism, but I'm glad to be here and glad to be talking to you about Latin America today.
Yes, we were talking off mic, and China and the United States have, and it's a strange opening since we're going to be talking about Latin America, but China and the United States are in the midst of a Cold War, and it's being fought economically within the first 30 days of the new and revised Trump 2.0 regime in the United States. He's added more tariffs on Chinese products. China has cut off supply of numerous products. And one of those battle lines and frontline areas is South America and Latin America, where you find yourself living these days. So your boots on the ground there. Tell us what's happening.
Absolutely. One of the things that I'm observing immediately is that China's presence in the region is visible and that it's growing. Obviously, this is a big juxtaposition to what we've known in the decades prior, when the US was the largest trading partner for pretty much every single Latin American country. And now fast forward to 2025, and China is the largest trading partner for almost every single South American country, bar, I believe, Colombia, where I'm based, and also Ecuador. And really, it's a difference in strategy. China's developed this power and control in Latin America through something called soft power diplomacy, which differs very much from the historical means by which the US achieved power with the Monroe Doctrine. And we can talk a bit about the history of that. But obviously, we've seen Trump already, in true art of the deal style, trying to leverage Greenland and Canada in order to basically access resources, because this is all what this is, Mike. This is a resource war, and Latin America is just one of the battlegrounds in which it's taking place.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. But the difference between it and the other major battle line area, which is Africa, is that Latin America has always been considered to be our backyard. And you did mention the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah.
That was basically a Cold War doctrine that essentially said that anything in the Western Hemisphere, which is North and South America, mattered to the United States, and there were to be no interlopers into that space.
Yeah.
And you're quite right. It was never done with soft diplomacy. It was, done through hard diplomacy, CIA coups. Somebody once said that that dictator is a bastard, but he's our bastard.
Right. Careful what you say, Mike. Trump might hear you, we're in Miami,
Well, that's true, but he left town a couple of days ago, so I think
Okay.
I'm okay. But recently the Financial Times, I believe it was, had an article, and they referred to it as the Donroe Doctrine, where you were going to see kind of a bit of a return to that Monroe Doctrine with Trump 2.0. Now, you're down on the ground, given the history of how the United States has actually operated in South America. How much diplomatic damage has that done to these generations versus what happened over the 50s and 60s? Have they forgotten, or do they have long memories?
No, I think they absolutely remember. And that's why I feel as though they're very appreciative of China's more soft power diplomacy approach. But Trump himself, back in 2019, literally cited the Monroe Doctrine, saying it has been formal policy of our country since President Monroe that we reject the interference of foreign nations in this hemisphere. So he's been on record saying it. But I think it's just important to contextualize before we get into what Trump's doing today, in terms of what the Monroe Doctrine actually is, what it was, how it was used to basically earn America's title as the economic superpower of the world. So I mean, technically speaking, like the Monroe Doctrine declared that the Western Hemisphere was de facto under the sphere of influence of the US, but it also asserted that the Americas were off limits to European colonization. I think the better way to view the Monroe Doctrine is actually that it's a almost an entitlement, this a self-appointed license of the US to intervene in the business of other countries, and its principles have explicitly or implicitly guided the US foreign policy for over a century. The first real time when it was used was back in the 1898 Spanish-American War. And this was basically when the US kind of cited concerns over Spanish influence in Cuba and presented itself as Cuba's liberator from colonial rule. And then in 1904, it kind of became the Roosevelt corollary. And that saw the US rely on the same principles to take control of Dominican Republic's custom revenues so that the European creditors could not. This continued into the 1930s with the U.S. Marines entering Nicaragua and the government so that it could better align itself with U.S. policies. Basically, under the guise of preventing European interference, they entered these Latin American countries and gained power. And that's what they're doing today. Talk about Cuban Missile Crisis. You talk about Chile in 1973, when the U.S. supported a coup against the socialist president Salvador Allende. And it just brings you back up to today, where we are in 2025, where Trump is deploying the same tactics that has worked in the past. It might not be the kindest approach, and the bullying isn't exactly amenable and amicable, but it works, and it helps you to achieve power. So it's possible that we could see a reversal of China's dominance to the point where the US actually regains power.
Yeah, but they're going to have a long ways to go. Like we hear everybody freaking out over the BRICS. Well, last time I checked, the B in the BRICS was Brazil, which is one of the largest Latin American countries. You have still what would be considered leftist near communist regimes in Venezuela.
Yeah.
Cuba is definitely still communist.
Yeah.
Haiti, which is next to the Dominican Republic, is a basket case and really essentially ungovernable. But you see other things like Bolivia becomes a little bit more maneuverable. Ecuador's become a little bit more amiable. Argentina's just had a shift.
Yep.
But we can't turn our back again on history. It originally started out as a way to keep European colonization out of the Western Hemisphere, but at post-Second World War, it was, no longer about European colonization. It was about, keeping communists away from our back steps.
Right. It's very interesting, the parallel with today, if we look at it in the context of J.D. Vance's speech just a few days ago, almost alienating Europe and sort of de-Westernization, as we're calling it in the Ingold Trust Report. It's this fragmentation of the G7 in the same way that, America was trying to access the resource of Latin America for themselves today. They're kind of doing the same thing by disintermediating themselves from the G7. It's America against the world. And that might work. But like I say, we've got a long way to go to shake off China's dominance and the lead that it's generated. Just to give you an idea of like how China have been doing this, it's the same as Africa, actually. I think we did a podcast about that about a year ago.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately the top line thing that you need to think about is that the China Development Bank administered a $20 billion special loan program back in 2014. And in addition to that, it's been deploying country-specific infrastructure investments since then. One of the most notable examples of that is the $3.6 billion that was sent by China to build a megaport in Peru, in Chanque. And this is basically creating a new trade route between South America and Asia, so opening up China to the world. And this is the whole premise of the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the whole premise of Xi's desire to essentially escape a deflationary spiral, because that's actually the way that China is going to do this. It's actually by finding growth elsewhere across in other continents, in Africa and Latin America. But really, it's about these infrastructure investments. That's what's allowed China to become the largest trading partner for Chile, obviously one of the biggest, number one copper producer in the world. Same for Argentina. where it recently invested, I think, like $5 or $6 billion on hydropower projects. The same for Bolivia, which has, funnily enough, just become a BRICS member. China's spent about 2.4 billion in total through companies like CATL and CBC to develop lithium extraction facilities. So, of course, this is the thing about China's approach. It can be deemed debt trap diplomacy. Obviously, like that's a strategy where the creditor country lends excessive funds, leading borrowers to economic dependence or political concessions. But it's worked so far. The US has its own debt problems, and it's going to be interesting to see whether the US can really regain power under Trump. I mean, one thing that was a good episode recently in this resource war was how Trump handled Colombia. Threatening a 25% tariff, which would rise to 50% the following week if the Colombian president didn't accept the immigrants on the plane. And a day later, the Colombian president answered the phone and said, Donald Trump, we'll take your immigrants. In fact, I'll even send my plane over there to collect them. And that just shows you that this approach does work. And China's got its work out with Trump.
Well, to some degree, it might work, but bullying only goes so far, and just like a lot of things that happens with Donald Trump, he does one thing in one direction, he wants something, and then he'll do something else that goes completely detrimental to what he's trying to accomplish. And as you point out, the Chinese are using soft diplomacy. They're utilizing debt and funds and building infrastructure all across South America. At the same time, you've got Elon Musk and his hacker collective running through USAID and, cutting programs and funds that, some of it, is wasteful, but others of it is actually doing the same thing that China's doing. So while the U.S. is sorting that out, China's just continuing on its merry little way.
Yeah. One country that I haven't mentioned that will be important to this relationship is Mexico. Trump's already been a slight battle with the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, obviously potentially placing 25% tariffs. And that's going to have critical consequences for metals like silver, because 75% of the silver that the US imports come from Canada and Mexico. So I think Trump needs to think twice before he actually proceeds with things like that, cutting off Mexico, which is the US's largest trading partner in 2024, surpassing both China and Canada. So Mexico is going to be important, and that's one to watch.
Yes, and the other thing to point out is Mexico is actually a lot closer to South America than what the United States is. So they can easily trade that trading partner to those Latin American countries. They speak a common language, with the exception of the Portuguese spoken in Brazil, but they have similar cultures. There's all sorts of reasons why that could shift Mexico to fulfill a void that America may be dropping.
Yeah, and this is it, Mike. Ultimately, it's just this overarching difference in strategies. The US has historically achieved this dominance and superiority in resources by imposing its military presence, or more recently, freezing assets. For example, with Russia freezing $300 billion of assets just before the war in February 2022. So it's got this kind of history of feeling as though it's entitled to the resources of the world. And maybe as the economic superpower you are, but that will alienate a lot of these countries. And that's why they're welcoming China with open arms, with its approach that is really just buying loyalty with infrastructure investments.
Yeah. And, again, we talk about the dichotomy of everything. The United States is being cut off from several critical metals from China and Chinese allies.
Right.
At the same time, you're alienating and not looking south in an appropriate way with countries that can basically pick up the slack and send it. Like I look at things such as tantalum as an example.
Right.
Well, China has cut off the tantalum supplied to the United States. They have a choice between a new tantalum refiner that's going to be opening in Quebec in the near future, and one that's in Brazil. And again, we point out that's the B in Brent. So if you're continuing with an antagonistic approach, where are you going to get these metals? And it would be very easy for Brazil, which is also a very large lithium producer, rare earth producer, and that's why they've got the processing plants there, is because the minerals are there and they're trying to supply it up the supply chain. It'd be really easy for them to join China and say, yeah, you can't have those. We'll sell them someplace else.
Absolutely. And you make a great point about those minor metals. I mean, even here we're seeing it with the presence of antimony companies, tungsten companies, all these minor metals that are finding themselves in the crosshairs of China export controls, or just simply the US-China trade war and the threats that are arising from that. I think it presents a real opportunity for those companies that are exploring for those minor metals that can provide domestic supply chain security for the US, especially if there's US or Canadian mines mining these metals, because they're few and far between. And as you see, the price of antimony has skyrocketed simply for the fact that it's in high demand for all these military applications, and the supply of it is concentrated in BRICS countries. And the same for tungsten, the same for I think tin is another one that's interesting. And Latin America is a place of abundant resources. It's intensifying the resource war, and I think that's only going to be productive for metals prices in the longer term. In the short term, Trump may win. Trump may gain some ground in Latin America. But I think in the longer term, what he's going to do is he's going to alienate these Latin American countries until the point maybe where China becomes established trade partners, as they already are, and then maybe they become the colonizer themselves. And we go back to that debate of trading one colonizer for another, like you mentioned in Africa.
Yeah. Up until this point, though, I have found that the South American plan seems to be slated to building a supply chain up and down the supply chain, rather than just to take everything and send it off someplace else to be processed and turned into products or goods. But you live in Colombia.
Yeah.
Your boots on the ground in South America. How easy is it to spot a Chinese presence there, and how entrenched is it?
It's a great question. Well, one thing for sure is there's more Americans in Colombia than Chinese. That's for sure. They get called gringos, as you know. They can maybe come for different reasons than mining, but China's presence is less in terms of the people that are there. It's more in terms of the infrastructure investments, like I said. So literally 2 hours away from the city in which I was staying in for a period, Ibagué, there's a solar park that China has funded. And the local government there, who we had a meeting with, spoke about, talking with China, talking about how they can find synergies and knowledge. And really, China are the ones who are showing attention to Colombia at a time where the United States are kind of showing them the hard shoulder, the cold shoulder. And I think, whilst right now America still is Colombia's largest trading partner. We can't escape that fact. But if it continues in this way, I think we could see China take over. And already the embassy was kind of jubilant after the Chinese Colombian embassy was jubilant after Trump's tariff threats that he imposed on Colombia, because they know what's coming. That they know that means an opportunity for them to partner with a country that's got abundant natural resources. We're talking gold, particularly coal as well in Colombia. And China is setting records for coal production in 2024, as we know. And it's going to continue to do that.
So if you were advising President Trump and his cabinet and everything, how would you advise them to implement a Donroe, not a Monroe, but a Donroe doctrine in such a way that it would, ease the Chinese out of the region and get America past, over 130 years of questionable history?
I think there needs to be some kind of bilateral trade agreement or some kind of huge infrastructure investment that signals, no, this is our trade partner. This is the historical relationship that we've developed. And China's not going to take it from us. I think there needs to be a statement of intent, but we can't deny that the Donroe Doctrine style of threatening these tariffs worked, because ultimately Trump got what he wanted. The immigrants returned to Colombia, and we're seeing the same thing happening in other Latin American countries. If you look at Venezuela, Maduro's taking the immigrants back. In Panama, they're taking immigrants back. Some of these Latin American countries, I believe it's Costa Rica, are even taking back immigrants from other Latin American countries as a third party. So it's kind of that instruction to Colombia was a statement in itself. But I think in the longer term, if Trump continues to do that, he will alienate Latin American countries, and he probably needs to consider at least trade agreements that are mutually beneficial, if not infrastructure investments.
So essentially, he's been taking a hammer to a fly. But how long can you do that? Every little irritant, he threatens tariffs, and eventually, he'll become the boy who cried wolf because he never follows through. Or these countries will get to the point where, yeah, if you tariff me, I don't care anymore because I've already tariff-proofed my economy from all of this.
That's the problem. The countries who are unfortunate enough to be subjected to these tariffs will learn to live without the US, and they'll forge their own path and forge their own trade agreements with other countries. And it just makes them more likely to, join the BRICS, like we've seen with Bolivia. Bolivia is a new BRICS member as of the beginning of this year. And I think that's going to continue unless the US actually pulls its finger out and says, hello, Latin America, we want to work with you, not against you.
And of the Latin American countries, there's Brazil, there's Bolivia. What others are in the BRICS bloc?
I believe there's actually some information that I saw in Chile. There was an event that was held at the university, one of the universities in Chile, which was exploring the idea of Chile joining the BRICS, which could be very interesting because that's a huge, copper belt. In Peru as well, that copper mineralization continues up the coast. And like I say, China's just invested $3.6 billion in a megaport in Peru. And you can bet your bottom dollar that a whole load of Peruvian and Chilean copper is going to be making its way across to China as a result of that infrastructure investment. So that's the thing. It's if Trump doesn't act now, then in a way that's reconciling these relationships with these Latin American countries, the US could be on the back foot for the years to come.
4 years from now, it could be looking a lot worse if they don't make a change in approach soon.
I mean, it might work, Mike. This is the thing. It might work for 4 years. The countries in Latin America might be so terrified of losing America's trade that they just fold to Trump's every command. But there's also the flip side, which is that they could learn to live without America, and America could lose that and become its kind of island that just trades with nobody but itself.
Yeah, well, that's a possibility. Well, lots to talk about, and it's good to have you on the ground in Latin America. We can see up close what happens over the course of the next several years. So thank you very much for joining me in Miami, and look forward to discussing this with you further. Now, our next edition, by the way, that article that Ted references in our January edition. In our next edition, what do you got on tap for us?
I think we're going to continue the theme, to be honest, Mike, with the resource wars, with the theme of this US-China trade war. Although actually, I think for this issue, we're going to be looking into specifically gold and silver, which I'm actually going to be speaking about in a moment. The idea that silver in the long run will outperform gold is something that I've believed in quite considerably over the course of my short, relatively nascent career as an analyst. It's not that I don't think gold will outperform, because I really do believe it will and continue to drive forward as this central bank demand pushes gold to new highs. But silver is so historically undervalued, and I think the market quite hasn't processed that yet, and that's what I'm going to be writing about in the next issue.
Wonderful. That'll be out shortly, and readers should be looking forward to that. Thanks very much for joining me. But if in the meantime, if people want to follow your work, where to follow you?
Yeah, it's tedjbutler.com, my website, or Ted J Butler on LinkedIn.
Perfect. Till
Thanks,
next
Mike.
time.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
The Prospector News Podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.